Did you know that deep beneath ancient volcanic islands, life exists in ways that defy everything we thought we knew about biology? No sunlight, no trees, no oxygen-rich air, just stone, toxic gas, and a darkness so complete it feels like the edge of another world. And yet something lives there, something that's been evolving in isolation for millions of years, tucked away in the cooled veins of Earth's fiery past. These are not fantasy creatures. They are real, and scientists are only beginning to uncover the secrets of their survival. It begins with a narrow cave mouth on the flank of a long-dead volcano. Above ground, the island looks barren, its surface cracked and scattered with ash-colored rock. But underneath lies a labyrinth of lava tubes. Hollow tunnels formed when molten lava flowed through, and the outer crust hardened, leaving behind winding corridors carved by fire. One such tunnel became the entry point for a team of biologists, geologists, and explorers armed with cameras, lights, and an unshakable curiosity about what might still stir in the Earth's shadows. As they descended, the light faded quickly. The temperature dropped, but the air grew thick, damp, heavy, faintly tinged with sulfur. Every sound, from the drip of condensation to the crunch of gravel underfoot, echoed like whispers in a cathedral of stone. The lava tube narrowed, curving left and right, like the passageways of some ancient creature's fossilized arteries. Then, in the beam of a headlamp, they saw it, clinging silently to the rock wall. At first glance, it looked like a shadow, but when they focused, they realized it had legs. 8 of them. Thin, jointed, long as twigs. Its body was flat, pale, almost translucent, and strikingly, it had no eyes. It didn't move, not even when light hit it directly, simply stayed frozen, like it had always been there, waiting. This was a lava tube spider, a species that lives its entire life in absolute darkness, a creature sculpted by isolation and the passage of geologic time. It never needed to see. Over countless generations, its ancestors' eyes had withered away, replaced by heightened sensitivity to vibration, airflow, and touch. Scientists had hypothesized about such organisms, but seeing it, a living being shaped by an underground world, was something else entirely. These spiders don't spin webs across branches or sneak through grassy undergrowth. They stalk prey that shares their blindness, navigating the cave floor by minute tremors, tracking movement through stone, waiting motionless until the precise moment to strike. Each limb is an antenna, each step a calculated risk. This isn't just adaptation, it's survival artistry, perfected in total silence. The spider wasn't alone. As the team advanced, more life revealed itself in flashes of legs, antennae, and glistening surfaces. Cave-adapted centipedes with armored exoskeletons, tiny beetles without pigment, and, most astonishingly, faintly glowing insects that shimmered like distant stars under low light. Their bioluminescence wasn't for beauty, but communication, tiny flashes in the dark meant to find mates, warn rivals, or coordinate silent movements. Deeper in, the air changed, became warmer and more pungent. On the cave floor, patches of yellow-white residue began to appear, not mold, but something far stranger. Samples were collected, examined, and what the scientists found left them speechless. These weren't fungi or lichen. They were colonies of sulfur-eating bacteria, extremophiles that survive not on sunlight, but on chemical energy pulled from volcanic minerals. Where most life forms would suffocate, they thrive. They digest rocks. They breathe sulfur. They build invisible empires in complete darkness. These bacteria are part of a food chain hidden from the surface world. In their presence, scientists began to realize they weren't just looking at isolated oddities. They were witnessing an entire subterranean ecosystem. The bacteria feed on the volcanic minerals. Other microorganisms feed on them. Those, in turn, become prey for small invertebrates, which are stalked by spiders and centipedes. It's a living web, self-contained, bound to no tree, no sun, no wind or rain. A biosphere born of fire and maintained by the chemistry of stone. One of the younger researchers whispered, as if afraid to disturb the balance, "If life can thrive here, what does that say about everywhere else we've ruled out?" It wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was a philosophical shift. For years, scientists had debated the possibility of life beyond Earth. But what they saw here, creatures living without light or air, brought that debate into sharper focus. If this is possible here in the belly of an extinct volcano on a remote island, why not beneath the ice of Europa or in the sulfuric clouds of Venus? The team paused near a junction in the lava tube system. Their maps, hastily updated by hand and laser scan, showed a narrow passage branching deeper. No signals reached that far. Radio was dead. EPS was meaningless. And yet they couldn't resist the pull of the unknown. Spiders with no eyes and bacteria that eat stone were just the beginning. What might be waiting in the deeper dark? The walls began to close in. The deeper the team moved into the earth, the more the air seemed to change. Not just in smell, but in presence. It was heavier, almost tactile, like it pressed gently against their chests with every step. The passage narrowed to a crawl space, forcing them to move on hands and knees through jagged mineral-slick stone. There was no ambient light, only the beams of headlamps cutting through a void so thick it felt like velvet. The further they descended, the more it felt as though they were passing out of time itself, slipping into a realm untouched. Since lava last flowed through these tunnels 1 million years ago, then the walls opened. Natural chamber, nearly spherical, with smooth rippling stone like frozen smoke. And in its center, a shallow depression filled with liquid, not water, but something thicker, iridescent, glowing faintly from within. This was not part of the initial survey. No maps mentioned it. No satellite imagery had picked up any sign. The team stood motionless, each trying to process what they were seeing. A small geothermal pool, fed from deep underground, rich in sulfur and minerals, releasing a low, hissing steam that danced like spirits in the lamplight. Floating on its surface were colonies of microbial mats, gelatinous, pale green, gently pulsing with life. Samples were taken carefully, reverently, like handling relics, and what they revealed defied expectation. These mats were composed of layered bacterial communities, each layer performing a different function, some converting sulfur into usable energy, others processing the byproducts of that reaction, still others capturing rare minerals as a nutritional base. They were ecosystems in miniature, biological machines perfectly calibrated to operate in a world with no sun. The real marvel came under magnification. Electron microscopy revealed strange structures, protein channels unlike any known bacterial formation. It's possibly evolved to capture trace amounts of thermal radiation. One researcher suggested, with cautious wonder, that these bacteria might be harvesting ambient geothermal energy itself. Not chemical reactions alone, but actual heat, absorbed at the molecular level. It was like photosynthesis in the absence of light, an entirely new survival paradigm. And they were not alone. Crawling along the lip of the sulfur pool was a small worm-like creature. No longer than a finger, translucent, segmented, and utterly alien. It had no mouth in the traditional sense, no eyes, no recognizable sensory organs. But it moved with purpose, twitching in subtle rhythmic bursts toward colonies of bacteria. Using tiny hooks along its body, it scraped the microbial film from the rock and consumed it in slow, deliberate motions. This was a grazer, a primary consumer in a food web built not on green plants, but yellow sulfur and black stone. The implications hit hard. On the surface, ecosystems are bound by sunlight. Every forest, every ocean, every grassy plain begins with light photosynthesis, and the energy that trickles up through herbivores to predators. But here, in this shadowed chamber of fire-forged stone, the rules are rewritten. Life begins not with light, but with heat. Not with green, but with pale microbial film. It is slow, patient, and efficient in a way that life on the surface doesn't have to be. Here nothing is wasted. Energy is transferred with precision. Waste from one organism becomes fuel for the next. Evolution has carved perfection from scarcity. As the team documented everything, photos, samples, environmental readings, a deep vibration hummed through the stone. Faint, almost imagined. Perhaps a distant geothermal tremor, or maybe even the resonance of shifting rock deep below. The sound wasn't threatening, but it reminded them of where they were. Inside the hollow arteries of a volcano, surrounded by millions of tons of ancient basalt. They were guests in a cathedral of pressure and time. One of the geologists noted something else: the age of the rock. Radiometric readings dated the chamber to over 700,000 years old, untouched by new lava or tectonic disturbance. This meant the ecosystem inside had likely been developing in isolation for nearly 1,000,000 years. A sealed bubble of evolution. A natural lab untouched by climate change, pollution, or human interference. And in that silence, life had written its own story, chapter by chapter, in microbial ink. Another question emerged, one that none of the scientists dared to say out loud. How far does this system go? If one chamber held such wonders, what might be hidden in others? Were there predator species adapted to absolute silence and chemical tracking? Were there multicellular organisms whose biology was entirely alien to surface anatomy? Could there even be forms of intelligence? Primitive? Decentralized? Microbial, perhaps? Functioning on rules we have yet to imagine? The chamber narrowed again ahead, sloping downward into another corridor. Their instruments registered increased humidity and higher sulfur concentrations. A good sign for microbial richness, but also a warning. The deeper they went, the closer they came to the molten breath of the earth. Temperatures might rise suddenly, their quality might drop. Still, the temptation was overwhelming. Whatever existed down that slope was an HS part of a science project. It was a message from Earth's past. A glimpse of how life began, or how it might begin again elsewhere. And so they pressed on, crawling into the next dark, cameras rolling, notebooks filling, hearts pounding. Somewhere ahead, the next impossible creature was waiting. The passage tightened into a throat of stone, winding down like the coils of something ancient and breathing. Moisture clung to the rock, warm now, laced with the bitter scent of minerals and something sharp, metallic, almost bloody. The deeper they went, the more the environment shifted from silence to a strange low rhythm. Not sound exactly, but a sensation, a hum through the soles of their boots. Like the earth was murmuring beneath them. The sensors were picking up spikes in geothermal gradients. They were close to a thermal pocket, a chamber heated by the smoldering residue of the volcano's ancient heart. They emerged into a new cavity, this one taller, with chimney-like shafts cutting upward through the rock. Warm vapor vented in slow plumes, and from the mist rose a bizarre sight. Threads of slime stretching like delicate webs across the ceiling and walls, catching droplets of condensation that shimmered in the glow of their headlamps. At first they thought it might be fungus, but when a drop of warm mist touched one strand, it recoiled, coiling back on itself like a muscle reacting to a burn. This was not fungus. It was alive. Closer examination revealed something stranger still. These threads were extensions of a colonial organism, a super-thin membrane of cooperative bacteria and archaea. They formed complex lattice, using the cave's thermal drafts to catch microscopic particles drifting up from deeper vents. In essence, they were filter feeders, like underwater corals, but built entirely from microbes and suspended in midair. These colonies twisted slowly, responding to heat and chemical changes, redirecting their tendrils like a biological weather vane. Every centimeter of them was tuned to a world beyond human senses. And beneath them, crawling slowly across the damp floor, was something the team had not expected to find at all. A crustacean, a small, ghostly white isopod, scuttling sideways with cautious, twitching legs. It looked like a creature from the deep sea, one of those strange animals that haunt hydrothermal vents miles below the ocean's surface. But they were hundreds of meters above sea level in a volcanic cave system. What was it doing here? The answer, as it turned out, was hidden in the chemistry. The cave's mineral profile mirrored that of certain undersea vents, rich in sulfides and rare earth elements. The same kind of environment that had fostered ancient extremophiles in oceanic trenches was somehow replicated here in a subterranean air-filled equivalent. It wasn't a perfect match, but it was close enough. This isopod, or its ancestors, may have once lived in coastal fissures, only to be trapped or redirected into these lava tubes by geological shifts. Over time, cut off from the sea, it adapted. Now, it walked on land in damp heat, scavenging bacterial mats and feeding on soft-bodied invertebrates that emerged from the cracks. One of the biologists crouched, watching it move, "It's a ghost of the ocean," he whispered, a memory walking through stone. The team began to piece it all together. It wasn't just an isolated system, it was a bridge. A biological corridor connecting the deep sea with underground volcanic ecosystems. And perhaps by extension, a model of how life might bridge otherwise unbridgeable environments. Life that once lived in water, slowly adapting to heat, gas, stone, and air, not surface air. This air was too thin, too sulfur-rich, but just enough to allow respiration by organisms built for extremes. As they recorded data, one of the thermal scanners began to stutter. Then it spiked. A sudden burst of heat pulsed from a shaft deeper below. Not from magma, but from a geothermal updraft, pushing superheated gases into the chamber. In the swirl of mist that followed, something flashed. Not light, but motion. Something moving against the wall. Fast. Far too fast for any of the creatures they'd seen before. It vanished behind a fold of stone, and by the time lights were focused, it was gone. Whatever it was, it had mass. The floor bore faint indentations, too deep for an insect, too wide for a spider, and yet no tracks led away. It was as if it had melted back into the wall. The team was silent. The cameras rolled. And a choice was made. They would go further. The passage down grew narrow again. Sensors were pushed ahead on tethers, measuring air composition and heat. The oxygen was thinning, levels rising. But it was still navigable, just barely. And so, they advanced. Entering what the data suggested was the final chamber of this route. A wide, uneven cavity, partially flooded with warm mineral-rich water. Steam clung to the walls like ghostly skin. Stalactites glittered with yellow and green mineral deposits. Beneath the shallow water movement, dozens, maybe hundreds, worm-like organisms writhing just below the surface. Their bodies pulsed with bioelectric flickers, like dim lightning beneath glass. These were not passive feeders. They reacted to the lights. Some retreating, others surging forward, curious or aggressive. The team watched in awe. These creatures were unlike anything in the surface biosphere. Their nervous systems seemed distributed, not centralized. No clear heads, no eyes, but responsive to light, sound, and perhaps even electromagnetic fields. They were built to survive and communicate in total sensory deprivation. And they were doing so now, perhaps reacting not just to presence but to pattern. One researcher noticed. Their pulses weren't random, they flickered in rhythm. Maybe not language, but something close. What they had found here was not just life, it was life reorganized. It's life stripped of its reliance on the sun, on the open air, on the constraints of the surface. These were descendants of survivors, each species a testimony to the raw persistence of biology. And as the steam thickened and the hum of the deep rocks surged once more, they realized they had not yet reached the end. There was more, something older, something waiting, deeper still. The walls began to sweat. Not with water, but with heat. Pulses of warmth that came and went like shallow breathing. The chamber behind them faded into the mist, leaving only the narrow slit of rock ahead. There was no breeze, no sound beyond their own boots scraping stone, their breath in the respirators, and the occasional pop of water droplets landing on something far too hot to stay liquid for long. Still they pressed forward. Curiosity or something deeper pulled them on, step by a careful step. This time the tunnel twisted sharply downward, sloping at a near 40-degree angle. The rock here was different, smoother, melted. As if this part of the lava tube had once carried a more recent, far hotter flow, and then suddenly sealed. The temperature readings climbed fast. They were now in a zone where human presence was barely sustainable. But they couldn't turn back, not yet, because there, in the distance, barely visible through the haze, was a glow. Not artificial, not from their lights, came from the stone itself. Faint bioluminescent patterns glowing in soft reds and oranges, like fireflies trapped in basalt. At first they thought it was just a trick of minerals and heat. But as they approached, it became clear. The glow moved, slowly, deliberately, tracing across the wall like liquid veins of lava, pulsing in rhythm. It wasn't rock. It was alive. Microbial colony spread across the chamber walls, living in symbiosis with the heat itself. These weren't just bacteria. They were layered sheets of cells that fed on geothermal radiation. Actual extremophiles evolved not just to endure extreme temperatures, but to depend on them. The outer layers glowed with a byproduct of their metabolism, using luciferin-like compounds to signal internally. They weren't glowing for defense or to attract prey. They were communicating, coordinating growth, guiding chemical energy to different regions of their own living network. The team stood in silence, awestruck. It was as if they had discovered the nervous system of the cave itself. This wasn't a habitat, it was a body, superorganism, stretching who knew how far through the stone, pulsing with quiet chemical thought, and there was more. In the center of the room, surrounded by this living wall, stood a cluster of stone pillars, naturally formed but oddly symmetrical. Between them, a pool, perfectly circular, shallow, bubbling faintly from below. The water wasn't scalding, but it shimmered with suspended minerals and threads of microbial gel that writhed like smoke. This wasn't just another thermal feature. It was the heart of the ecosystem. Creatures circled within the pool. Not many, just 3, maybe 4. Slender, eel-like forms, not fish, but something older. Their skin was smooth, scaleless, the color of old ash. No jaws. But along their sides ran rows of electrical sensors, twitching slightly as they glided in slow, perfect loops through the mineral haze. They moved in silence, but not without purpose. Occasionally one would brush the wall and release a burst of light through the colony, a flare of orange or blue, which would ripple out like a message. Another would respond, flicking its body and triggering a second signal. The researchers could hardly breathe. This was communication, not just between animals, but between different domains of life. Multicellular vertebrates are close to it, talking to microbial mats through biochemical language. And then, for just a moment, one of the creatures surfaced. Its body arched out of the water, a glimmering thread of translucent skin. On its head was no mouth, no nose, but something that looked like a frond, a fan of sensitive cilia fluttering in the warm air, tasting the world, held there, motionless, as if sensing the newcomers. And then it slipped back beneath the surface without a sound. The team stood motionless, each of them overwhelmed by the understanding that was slowly creeping in. This was not a fluke of biology. This was a system. An entire world evolved in parallel with ours, but hidden under layers of fire and stone. A place where evolution had taken a different path, not guided by light, or air, or sound, but by heat, mineral, and time. Unimaginable time. Millions of years of uninterrupted development, untouched by surface weather, seasons, or even the cycle of day and night. It was as if they had discovered Earth's alternate history, a version of life that might have dominated the planet if the surface had never cooled, sunlight had never reached the crust, if only heat and rock had been available to shape biology. One of the biologists knelt beside the pool, watching the light patterns play along the walls. He whispered, not to anyone in particular, This is what life might look like on a volcanic moon. The others didn't respond, because they were already thinking it too. About Io, Europa, and Enceladus, about Mars, about all the places we'd written off as barren, just because they weren't like Earth. But what if Earth had been like this all along, and we just hadn't looked deep enough? Their equipment buzzed. Power was draining, oxygen supply ticking down. They had to go. Not because the cave had rejected them, but because their bodies weren't built for this place. They were visitors in a realm they could barely begin to understand. And so, with final scans and lingering glances, they turned back. Step by step, the chamber disappeared behind them, swallowed again by mist and stone and heat. The light faded. The sounds returned to stillness. But something lingered. Lest they left, one last ripple passed through the glowing microbial wall. A slow, pulsing wave, as if the cave itself were exhaling. Not goodbye, just acknowledgement. They were seen.
The way back felt longer, heavier, not just from the climb or the heat, but from the weight of what they now carried in their minds. Each footstep echoed a little differently, no longer the crisp, curious tapping of explorers, but the hushed retreat of those who had seen something sacred. Behind them, The cave grew still once more, and ahead lay the thinning air and the dim promise of sky. But they weren't the same people who had entered. Something had shifted. Not just in their understanding of life, but in their perception of Earth itself. When they finally emerged from the mouth of the lava tube, the late sun hung low over the ocean. Warm light washed over them, almost blinding after hours in the deep dark. The breeze tasted sharp, salty, ordinary. Birds wheeled overhead. A distant wave broke against basalt cliffs. And yet, everything felt surreal, like they were standing on an alien planet that just happened to wear Earth's skin. They didn't speak much that first hour, just breathed. Let their bodies adjust. Let their thoughts catch up. It wasn't until they began reviewing the footage, the camera rolls, the biosensor data, the audio logs, that the magnitude of what they had discovered truly began to settle in. The images were almost too strange to believe. Spiders with no eyes hunting in pitch black. Microbial colonies glowing like constellations inside the Earth. Eyeless eel-like creatures exchanging biochemical pulses in a pool surrounded by living walls. And the data? It told a story even more astonishing than the visuals. New species, many. Some so genetically distant from known life that they formed entire new branches on the tree of life. Metabolic processes never before observed. Protein structures adapted for high heat, low oxygen environments. Ecosystems independent of photosynthesis. Communication between species through chemical light. But the real revelation wasn't in the novelty. It was in the connection. Each organism, from the sulfur-eating bacteria to the cave-dwelling invertebrates, to the elegant, ghostly swimmers, they all existed not as isolated freaks of nature, but as parts of a system, a complete, functioning ecosystem. One that had developed in total darkness, driven not by sun or weather, but by the breath of the planet itself. Heat, mineral, pressure, and time. And that ecosystem wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Scientists had theorized about such systems. Some had studied analogous environments at hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean. But to find such a network of life on land, in air-filled caverns within reach of the surface, it changed the equation. It suggested that life's requirements were far broader, far more adaptable than we ever dared imagine. It raised new questions. How many more systems like this exist? In other lava tubes on other volcanic islands? Beneath continental basalt flows? Deep inside Mars? Or the frozen moons of the outer solar system? What if we've been looking for life in all the wrong places? Searching for sunlight and surface clues, when the real miracle is buried in heat and stone. The expedition's findings sent ripples through the scientific world. Papers were written, peer reviews poured in. The footage, when released, sparked a firestorm of interest. People were fascinated, not just researchers, but everyday viewers, students, adventurers, dreamers. Comments flooded the video with awe, curiosity, even fear. Is this how life started? Could something like that evolve intelligence? Are we the outsiders? And under it all, one feeling surged stronger than the rest. Wonder. Because somehow, in the deep silence of ancient lava tubes, the Earth had whispered a truth we'd nearly forgotten. That life is not fragile. It is relentless. It adapts. It survives in poison and pressure, in darkness and silence. It thrives where we expect death. And it does so with elegance, precision, and a quiet kind of beauty. In the final scene of the footage, the camera catches the last glimpse of that glowing cave wall, right before the team turned back. The light pulses, slow and rhythmic, fading into the dark. A heartbeat, not of a single creature, but of a hidden world. alive, aware, and very much watching. The narrator's voice fades in, low and thoughtful. If this is what waits beneath our feet, imagine what waits beyond the stars. If what we just uncovered lies hidden beneath our own planet, what else might be waiting out there? In the shadows, in the silence, beyond the stars. If this story stirred your curiosity, or made you see the world a little differently, imagine what else we could explore together. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Leave a comment. What do you think lives in the places we haven't dared to look? And if you know someone who still thinks we've seen all there is to see on Earth, share this with them. Let them know we've barely scratched the surface.